you get to do a tasting, and it's just, we try to make it an experience. So I'm going to start a little bit with the history behind Westland as a company, of course, and then we're going to go through the entire production area. And again, I love answering questions. So like, shoot, I'm sure we have people that are like novice whiskey drinkers and people that are like whiskey nerds like myself that have been doing this for a few years. So fire them away. So the history behind Westland Distillery, we've been around for about 10 years. It's pretty exciting, but very new for a distillery compared to Scotland, of course. But our co-founder, Matt Hoffman, he is a local boy. He grew up in the Tacoma, Puyallup area, and him and his business partner, Emerson Lamb, started this company when he was still a teenager. I mean, that's when initially it got started. A little bit about Matt. He's just a firecracker. He had some, knowledge of the brewing industry, and he was looking at what they'd been doing for, centuries, and looking at their ingredients. So in the brewing industry, it's not uncommon, of course, to use like roasted barley and all these specialty malts. And he took a moment to step back and looked at what the whiskey industry was doing. And he's like, why isn't this happening? Like, we do not see roasted barleys. We don't see special varietals being used in whiskey, yet they're being used all the time in the brewing industry, and they have awesome flavor. Like, what's happening here? So it didn't sit well with him. He loved whiskey, wanted to start a distillery. And definitely have some fun stories on Matt. He went to UW for his undergrad, and already at 18, 19 years old, how do I put this? He started brewing and distilling, maybe not in his dorm room. Don't tell anybody. I have stories from his mom saying that she walked in one time to his dorm room and just saw like a few buckets percolating in the corner, and she was like, what is happening? Should I be concerned? So that's Matt at a very young age. So he actually had to wait until he turned 21 to actually start the company, because it's whiskey, and you're not legally old enough to consume alcohol. You can't quite be running a company that produces it. So that's a little bit behind Matt. And we're actually very lucky as a company with how we began. So distillery is very expensive, and it's very time consuming in the beginning, especially if you're making whiskey, right? Because whiskey takes time to, of course, age. And again, there's a lot of upfront cost. So with his business partner, the Lamb family was in the lumber industry. So they actually helped fund us in the beginning so that we didn't have to make things like gin or vodka or things that, like we weren't interested in making. We've been able to make 100% whiskey 100% of the time. So that is definitely the rare case. And we specialize in making American single malt whiskey. So to break down what that is, I'm sure maybe you've heard like, okay, what is single malt? What is malt? So it's 100% malted barley. So if you're a single malt Scotch drinker, it's going to be really similar in terms of the grain. But what makes us different from single malt Scotch is that we're using those roasted barleys. We're using some different casks that you're not seeing from over there. And that is really our highlight, is using those malts. So when we look at the Pacific Northwest, Matt early on realized like, hey, this is a perfect growing region for barley. Barley tends to thrive in those wet, cooler climates. Sort of like how corn thrives in the Midwest with those hot summers, right? So that's why, that's bourbon country over there for sure. And it's like, bourbon's great, but there's plenty of places making really good bourbons already. Like, why make another one? There's not enough people making American single malt whiskey. And actually, it's not a legally defined category of whiskey in the US or in the world yet, which sounds kind of crazy because a lot of places are making American single malt. Even locally, we have Copperworks. If you're a fan of Balcones in Texas, we got Stranahan's down in Denver, Colorado. So there's definitely more places that are hopping on and saying like, yeah, we want to make American single malt. So we have been pushing in the last like 5 or 6 years to get this category defined and have some rules behind it, and so that we can be identified a little bit better. So more to come on that. Now, when we break down what whiskey is, it's actually quite simple. If you're a beer fan, actually, we are making beer in the beginning. Actually, we are milling, we're using that malted barley, we're mashing, okay, and we ferment. That's where beer stops, unless they decide to age. But we are furthering this by distilling. So you'll be able to see exactly what equipment we're using to do this in just a few minutes. But it's simple. So we're using our grain, we need yeast, we need water, and then of course we need wood for our barrels to age our whiskey in. So those ingredients, although there's only a few, Matt wanted to really maximize the potential in each of those. So we're going to actually start with the barley first on that. But just to give you a glance real quick, let me actually step back because we're in our cask room right now. So turning around this way, you guys can see a little bit of our cask room. Now I'll talk more on aging at the end, but you'll see there's a lot of barrels here. This only represents like less than 5% that we're aging actually right now. We have some rack houses that we've been aging our barrels in Hoquiam, and now we just finished building some new ones up in Skagit Valley, and we're in the process of actually moving about 6,600 barrels from Hoquiam to Skagit Valley. So this will take about 2 to 3 months of every day driving back and forth. So let's go down here and talk about barley a little bit. So it's been a really exciting time the last few years. Like I said, we started off as a small company here in Seattle. In the very beginning, we didn't have a place where we could brew and ferment and distill all together. We were actually contracting out and mashing with another brewery, and then we would transfer in our location. So we've actually only been in this building since 2013. And if you're familiar with the Etterich Crane Company, they were in this building for about 100 years. So we actually left a lot of the woodwork. You'll see this awesome kind of skylights up here. Very, very fun. So you'll see these giant super sacks as well. That is all malted barley. We get it shipped here to the distillery in 2 different ways, and these super sacks are one of them. So they are very, very heavy. Sometimes they fill up the entire cask room, and we also will get trucks that fill up our silos in the back. It's Seattle. We don't have a lot of space, so we don't have these giant, silos like you see in the country, but we do what we can. So speaking of barley, I'm just going to ship it this way so you can kind of see what we're looking at here. So this is a selection of some of the malted barleys that we're using. Now, it was really important to Matt to, make our products as local as possible. A big, reasoning behind that is he actually went to Scotland and studied over there, and he fell in love with Scotch. He fell in love with peated whiskey specifically. And he's like, man, this really tastes like the land it's from. And he thought, like, how can we do that? The whiskey that tastes specifically like where it's coming from. And so that's why we're trying to have as much like locally grown and malted barley as possible. We're also using, local species of oak tree in this area, the water source, of course. So over 80% of our 5 malt mash bill, which is basically our like house malt or our house recipe of grains that we use in the vast majority of our whiskey, over 80% are grown here in Washington. And we've actually just started growing some of our first estate barley up in Skagit Valley. We recently purchased about 80 acres in Skagit Valley. So we bought a farm. It's great. It's coming along. And the most northern 20 acres are where we're going to be starting to grow this barley. So having some estate barley is pretty exciting for us. But the rest of it in the last 10 years hasn't come necessarily from Skagit Valley. It's come from all over, including the Palouse. Okay, so we're working with Great Western. We've been using Skagit Valley. And so you'll see this barley right here. Excuse me, this is Washington Select Pale Malt, and it makes up about 70% of our 5 malt recipe. So this is the barley that, if you're a Scotch fan, okay, this is what they're using, and it makes up typically 100% of the recipe. And the reason they use this pale malt is because there's the most sugar in it, and that's going to produce the most alcohol later on. So, when you're choosing a grain, you are going to be really picky. You want the highest yields. But again, that's where Matt stepped in and said, there's other barleys that have better flavor that maybe their yields aren't so great, but that's worth it. Like, we're after flavor, not just yields. Like, otherwise, what's the point of making whiskey if that's all you care about? So this is definitely very important. It's still got great flavor, and we need it to be able to produce our alcohol. And it's nice. It's a sweet grain, and they don't vary a lot, but this is what is making up 70% of that recipe. So very exciting. The other 4 that we see are all going to be specialty kilned and roasted barleys. Okay. So this next one is called Munich Malt, And despite its name, okay, it's not coming from Munich. It's actually coming from Eastern Washington. And you'll see it in a lot of really cool beers, some like darker, some lagers, for example. It provides a really cool, like nutty, bready, almost toffee flavor. And actually, when you chew on these, when you eat them or smell them, you can smell those more caramely, richer flavors coming out. Okay. Now, this next one, that last one actually made up 10% of the recipe. So that's our 80% from Washington. These next ones are specially roasted barleys. Okay, they're ones that we're getting from out of state just because no one's doing them here yet. We're hoping that Skagit Valley and some other places will help us out in the future so that we can eventually be 100% local. But this next one is called Extra Special Malts. It's coming from a malting company in Wisconsin, and they're the only place in the whole world that makes a specialty kind of malt. So you'll see it's a little bit darker. This one reminds me of like Honey Nut Cheerios, Honey Bunches of Oats. It's definitely very caramely. And already if you were to eat this, it's starting to taste a little bit more bitter as opposed to sweet. And that's from that roasting process. Now, these next two, my personal favorite, if you are a beer fan, you like porters and stouts, those dark, chocolatey, darker beers, these are the exact same barleys that are used in those beers. So the first one is our brown malt. This one is really, really dark. It's going to smell chocolatey, almost a little bit nutty. This one and our pale chocolate malts, okay, they're coming from the UK from the same company. And this pale chocolate smells like Cocoa Puffs. It doesn't taste like Cocoa Puffs. It tastes very bitter. That's why you're not seeing a whiskey using 100% of a pale chocolate malt. It would just come out very, very bitter and not enjoyable at all. So, but in small amounts, it adds some really cool flavor to our whiskey. For those of you, if you've had or have purchased our American oak whiskey, these darker ones really shine through. There is a very specific chocolate, kind of a light coffee note on the finish that shines through, and it's absolutely amazing. The only single malt Scotch that I'm aware of that actually uses a roasted barley in their recipe is Glenmorangie. They do their Signet bottle, and it does have a little bit of brown malt in there. So it's this cool chocolate note. And there's some bourbons as well that have used some like roasted chocolate rye, like Woodford put out one a couple of years ago. So, you know, people are getting adventurous and exploring, and it's pretty cool. So this is really what represents Westland. And every bottle that we do, Matt has been very adamant about, I want people to taste the barley. Like, I don't want them to just taste the cask that we're putting the whiskey in. Like, otherwise, what's the point? And you know, the wood can be very, very powerful. Like those of you that are bourbon fans, that new white American oak is very powerful. And if you have something delicate like barley can be sometimes, it can definitely get overpowered by the cask if you're not careful, which is why a lot of single malt scotches use ex-bourbon casks. They have used that reused wood so that, you know, it can kind of back off a little bit. So yeah, you will always taste our barley in our whiskey, no matter what the mash bill is, the recipe, or what type of cask we're using. Now, this is a good time to stop and just kind of briefly break down like what makes a barley malted exactly. I get asked that all the time, and maybe some of you guys have already asked Kate in the chat, but in a nutshell, okay, when we have that barley and it's growing out in the field, we harvest it. It's not enough to just throw those grains in a pot of boiling water like they're cooking rice and just expect to magically make whiskey. It doesn't work like that. These little seeds are like little packets full of starch that we need to access that starch, break it down to simple sugar. And the sugar is what the yeast is going to eat when we ferment and then produce alcohol. So again, why we want the most sugar we can get. To do that, you have to trick the barley seed into thinking it's time to germinate and become a plant. And what happens is it releases these enzymes that go, oh my God, like I need energy to grow and become this beautiful barley plant. So sugar is going to be that energy. So we do that by soaking the barley in water for a few days, and we let it sit and rest, and it starts to sprout. And that's where we have to stop that process because we obviously don't want a little barley plant. So we do that by drying it out. Okay, which is that kilning. If we want to roast barleys, it actually becomes very similar to how like coffee is roasted. It gets put in a specialty roaster, crank up the heat, and it's just like when you toast bread, you are creating these new colors and flavors, sort of like caramelizing. It's not quite like caramelization, but similar. And it's really, really cool. The The bad side, if there is a bad side of roasting barley, just like with coffee, is that the sugar content goes down. So that's why it gets so bitter. And so that's where we kind of balance everything of like, we have the sugar we need, we have the flavor, and we get that by having this 5 malt recipe. So those of you that are Scotch fans will also know that besides just like air drying that barley out, so it dries it out, in Scotland, traditionally, they would use peat, which is, it's not going to sound very delicious. It's a partially decayed vegetation. Okay, so if you think of bogs, wetlands, moors, all these trees and plants, they're going to die and they're going to compress in these wetlands where there's not a lot of oxygen. Okay, there's a lot of water, so it doesn't really it doesn't allow full decomposing, and so it just kind of builds up as this matter over thousands of years. And in Scotland, they would actually dig up chunks of this peat and let it dry, and they would use it as a fuel source. Not a very efficient one, might I add. So traditionally, peat was used because you had to fire up the stills, to dry out the barley, but it didn't produce a lot of heat, just a lot of smoke. And eventually they found out, oh my gosh, this smokiness is actually like leaving its mark on our barley, and it's creating this cool, smoky, earthy flavor. We're digging it. So nowadays, no one's using peat as a fuel source. They're 100% only using it for flavor. And it's one of those, I hate saying love or hate, but I also don't like saying acquired taste, but maybe it is. It grows on you. But it's the closest thing I could compare it to, if you've never had peated whiskey, perhaps mezcal in the spirits world. It's just this really cool smoky flavor, varying degrees, but depending on where you're harvesting that peat, it's going to affect the flavor. Sometimes it's more of a mossy peat, like on the islands, like Islay, if you're Ardbeg with Frog fan. Other times in mainland Scotland, it's more of a grassy peat, a little bit more like heather and like those sort of notes. So it's more of like a campfire smoke kind of flavor. So in the very beginning, Matt, again, fell in love with peated whiskey. He wanted to make it here because he knew we had wetlands all over Washington, but like no one knew how to do a peated barley. Like nobody malted with it. When we asked some of the malting companies, like, hey, can we use some peat? They're like, oh no, it's gonna like stink up our machines. So we don't want to be a part of that. Fair enough. But Matt actually found a private landowner in Shelton who had a peat bog on his property that we were able to access. So we have successfully harvested some Washington peat and made whiskey from it, and it's still aging for a few more years. But in the meantime, in the last 10 years, we have had to import some Scottish peat from the Highlands region. So it's more of that like grassy, woodsy campfire smoke. And that's actually going to be this barley right here. And it's a heavily peated barley. It's about 55 ppm. So it's definitely no joke. So in our core range peated whiskey, if you've had a chance to try that, this makes up about half the recipe. And it's really nice. It's a good introductory peated whiskey for people. But like I said, Skagit Valley Malting has been working with different techniques with our Washington peat. And, there was no blueprint with how to do a peated barley. And so they had to really start from scratch. And so the peat, they first used pellets, and they went to bricks. They smoked it for different amounts of times. So they've actually successfully had some peated barley that matches the strength of that Scottish peat, which is pretty fun. Now, once we get the barley here delivered at the distillery, the next step is to ground it down. So you'll see this is a little example right here of the final product out of our mill. You'll see it's not flour. We're not trying to crush up that barley to be really, really fine. We want to have some of the husk intact. We want some of the grits in there. It's just going to be easier to mash with because if it was a barley flour, it's going to clog up all your machines. It's not a fun thing to deal with. So I can quickly show you this way, our mill room. It's very dark in here, excuse me. This is our mill, okay? So it's not gonna be something like I said that's gonna be really powerful, like a stone mill or anything like that. It's actually a 4-roller mill. So it's just kind of gently crushing up that barley as it comes down from the top. And once it's done, okay, sorry, not very smooth at this. So it's actually going to shoot up this lovely piece of pipe right here into our mash room over there to be mashed. So I'm going to give you guys a look over here. Now, what exactly is mashing? What is the point of mashing? Sugar that we need, but while it's like we need to get it out. So to do that, we're going to add hot water to it. Okay, and we're going to put it in our mash tun. I do have a little flashlight so you guys can see in this. We're doing a lot of maintenance right now, so apologies. But this is our mash tun. Okay, so you'll see in here, there's these giant rakes. So all of the barley is going to be put in here. We're going to add really hot water to it in stages, and it's going to suck out all of that sugar. So our end result is going to be sugar water. And that is what we want to move on to ferment with. So over here, you'll see actually all of our fermenters. Okay, so we have 5 of them. We're basically doing 2 full mashes a day, and it's going to be 2 rounds at our mash tun to fill up one of these fermenters. So every day it'll be at a different stage. And when we're fermenting, okay, when we are adding in that yeast, it takes about 6 days to ferment, which is actually a really long time compared to, you know, brewing, or compared to in Scotland, it usually takes maybe 2 days. It's very, very quick. And part of the reason behind that is because we are not using a distiller's yeast. We are using a brewer's Belgian Saison yeast. So if you like Saison beers, okay, that is exactly what we're using. We use it in 100% of our whiskey. Matt actually experimented with about 33 different strains of whiskey, or sorry, 33 different strains of yeast in the beginning, and he settled on this one. And something he really liked is that when you ferment with the Saison yeast at a really high temperature, came higher than you probably would with brewing, it creates these really cool, like tropical fruit notes, kind of a banana note, which is really fun. And that shines through in some of our whiskeys, this cool fruity note. So he really liked that. So we don't vary past that. It's always the same. So when we get done with fermenting, we're going to have basically what we call a distiller's beer, and it's not very high percent alcohol. It's around the 5 to 6% mark, and that's okay. That's not gonna interfere with anything in the next step. So again, if we stopped here, we would have our beer, or if you're a wine fan, okay, wine is gonna also stop after fermenting. And that yeast is so important. And this is really when the flavor is first being created with our whiskey, okay? Yeast is creating alcohol. It's also creating lots of CO2, which you can't get around, unfortunately, but it's also creating so many flavor compounds, okay? What I call the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're not really being picky about that right here. We just want to let the yeast do its thing and then die. And then we can pick out the bad stuff and pull the good stuff when we're distilling in our next step. So that's where we're going next, is the still room, my favorite place in the distillery. Also the hottest place. You're gonna start sweating in here for when we're distilling. But let me give you a good viewpoint of what we're working with. So we have 2 stills here. Okay, the one on the left is our wash still, and then the one on the right, that is going to be our spirit still. Okay, you'll notice the color, they're both made out of copper, and that's not by accident. So when we're putting this wash, okay, our fermented wash into these stills, we are going to heat it up using these coils inside the stills. Let me show you that. So these giant coils, okay, which hasn't always traditionally been the case. Some places in Scotland still use direct fire underneath, which is great, but a little bit, you know, less safe and not as predictable or controllable. The coils are good to use, but copper is a really good conductor of heat. And it also latches on to a lot of the more yucky flavors that can come out from fermenting, some of the sulfates, so sulfury notes. Okay, nobody wants their whiskey to taste like rotten egg or burnt rubber. You know, a little bit of like new shoe, new rubber. I've definitely gotten those before, but there's other flavors that make it okay, I promise you. So that's the reason why this is copper. The more copper that you have in the most places during this part of the production process, in general, the lighter the whiskey is going to be and the more pleasant. But there's so many factors that also dictate that. So when we put it in our wash still, that's kind of the first run of heating it up. The whole point of distillation is to take advantage of the fact that alcohol has a lower boiling point than water. Okay, so that alcohol is going to start to vaporize and become steam, and we're going to capture that and separate it from the water. So it's actually going to go from our our still into our condenser. You'll see these up here. These are our two condensers. This is where it's going to cool off and recondense into a liquid. Now, after the first run in our wash still, it's still not high enough alcohol to be able to call a whiskey. So we have to do that process one more time. So we're going to put it into our spirit still over here, and we're going to do the same process, heat it up. And this is when we make our cuts. Okay. So the beginning of the run where it's a lower temperature, this is when things like methanol are going to come out, which you definitely don't want to drink methanol. You go blind or die. Either way, not great. So we want to make sure that doesn't get in our bottle of whiskey. The next phase is called the hearts. This is the good stuff. This is the most ethanol. This is the best flavors. So we want to capture that and put it in our hearts receiver tank down below. The final bit of the run, okay, when it's a really hot temperature, is what we call the tails or the feints. Nothing deadly poisonous here, but just funky flavors that you don't really want. Think like wet socks. It's kind of those like sulfury notes. If we're doing our peated whiskey, those phenolic compounds actually go a little bit into the feints run. So you kind of want it to last a little bit longer into that, and it's okay. This device right here in the middle, okay, this is where we are pulling samples of the heads, hearts, and tails. And what's kind of cool is that we can go off smell. We can literally smell the samples of whiskey and know, hey, that's in the hearts, that's the heads, that's the tails, you know, it needs to go a little bit longer. Obviously, we're not just going off of smell. That would not be great. Although if you're doing this for, 10, 20 years, you do train your nose very well. We are testing things like the pH level. We're looking at the amount of alcohol in there, the temperature, specific gravity, lots of fun stuff. So when it comes off the stills, it is crystal clear. It looks like water or vodka. Okay. If it's our hearts, it's definitely safe to drink. Although from my personal opinion, I don't think new make whiskey is the best in the world. I prefer wood aged. So, and so does everybody else here. So our next step is to age our whiskey. So in the last 10 years, it's in the production, we're in the distilling room, and we have driven it down to Hoquiam, which is a few hours away on the Washington coast, and it sits there for a minimum of 3 years to age in our barrels. Now, most stuff out right now, we don't have any age statements on our whiskey. We do release the age though on most of our whiskey, or at least the age range. So our core range whiskey, our American oak, our sherrywood, our peated, they're kind of in like more of the 4 to 5 year mark right now. And it's been kind of refining over the years, those flavors that we want in those whiskeys. So yeah, it'll be really exciting that now they won't be going to Hoquiam, they'll be going to our rack houses in Skagit Valley. So we won't be quite as spread out. But let's talk about some of those barrels, some of the wood that we use, because our wood program is fantastic and it's really cool to talk about. So I'm actually going to show you guys real quick some of our sample barrels. Okay, so these ones on top, okay, these ones are just for show. They're for tours because they are see-through. So these ones right here are examples of some of our ex-bourbon barrels and some of our new white American oak barrels. As you can see, they are not full, and that's because with oak, okay, it's very porous, it's very flavorful, but it does allow oxygen to get in through the wood. And what's going to happen is that's going to help develop flavors. Okay, it's a good thing, but also it's going to cause some evaporation. So over the years, that's called the angel share. You're going to lose some of that whiskey. Okay, ours is really similar to Scotland. We're about 2 to 3% annually. I know some other places, I just recently read that even Stranahan's in Denver, because of the dry climate and the high altitude, they're about 8% a year. Same with Kentucky over there. They're about the same, about 7-8%. Texas, Taiwan even can be higher. If you're a rum fan and your rum's coming in from the Caribbean, I mean, that's a 10% annually their loss. So it is a reason why an older whiskey will always be more expensive, because you're losing so much. After 20, 30 years, you're only going to have like this much left in your barrel. So you're not going to get many bottles out of it. But you'll kind of be able to see the color difference. Okay. So this is our reused barrel over here. So it's a little bit darker, a little bit used. This one looks very fresh looking. It's very bright. Okay. So I like thinking of barrels, okay, or casks as giant tea bags. Okay, so for tea drinkers, you'll definitely get this, right? The first time you use your tea bag, you're getting the most color, the most flavor. I can re-steep that bag a second time, but I can, even if I steep it for 45 minutes, I'm never going to get the flavor and the color as I did the first time. So that's what the wood does. And that second steep, okay, as you will, is not a bad thing, because again, if you want more of your grain to shine through and more of the distillate instead of the wood, you're going to like those second, third refill casks for sure. And, sometimes it's a rule. You have to use that first time virgin oak, like bourbon. We aren't restricted by that rule doing single malt. So we've been able to use a lot of different casks. I'm switching back real quick. Now, our ex-bourbon casks, we get them from all over the country. I would say mainly what we're getting are ex-Buffalo Trace casks, a lot of ex-Heaven Hill. Okay. Outside of bourbon, a lot of ex-Jack Daniels casks, which we like using because it's pretty consistent flavor and consistent results. So our blender definitely likes using those. Our new oak over here, we're working with Independent Stave Company out of Missouri. And we really like working with them because they are air drying our wood instead of kiln drying. So this white American oak is actually going to air dry for about 18 months up to 2 years. So it's definitely a process of patience or it's a labor of love, if you will. And we have two different types of new oak casks that we use from them. One of them is going to be a high char or a heavy char with a light toasting of the wood. And the other one's basically flip-flops. So it'll be a light char with a heavy toast. Now, just like with the barley when we're roasting it, okay, that's developing flavor. The toasting and the charring is also helping to kind of create flavor. The charring is also kind of filtering out some of the yucky, sulfates that we don't want to have. And it also pulls some of that sugar out of the wood, because wood definitely has some sugar and kind of notes to pull out. So it's very exciting to have those different options that we can play with. Now, these ones over here, you'll notice are quite a bit bigger than these ones over here. These are sherry casks. Okay, so we have a hogshead on the right and we have a sherry butt on the left. Now, if you're not a sherry fan or if you've never had sherry, definitely go out and drink some. It's amazing. We're kind of in this predicament right now that, not a lot of people are drinking sherry, but in the whiskey industry, everybody wants to have a sherry cask. And unfortunately, the only way to get a sherry cask from these bodegas, okay, basically they're distilleries, is if one goes out of business, because they will, the way they age sherry, they will reuse these sherry casks for, 100+ years, literally until they break apart and they cannot use them anymore. So, we can't really be waiting around for sherry bodegas to be going out of business just so we can get their casks. But we have been working close with a cooperage and some bodegas in Spain. So we have a good number. We have stopped purchasing these sherry casks, just as we've stopped purchasing the Scottish peat, since we're trying to focus on more of this local provenance as much as possible. So you will definitely see plenty of sherry cask finished Westland whiskeys in the future, but you definitely were, definitely looking at minimizing it in our core range, for example. So whiskey is definitely wonderful with the sherry influence, sherry being in these casks for 100+ years, you can only imagine how much has been soaked into the wood. So that flavor is great. And the way we've been shipping these sherry casks from Spain, we ship them whole, which is more expensive, but it's worth it, because when you break down these sherry casks into staves, it dries out and you lose a lot of the flavor. And also it's a higher chance of something breaking. So we definitely work with it in a different way. These other casks down below, I will show you. They're pretty interesting. You'll see they're very large. They are actually butt size, but this is new American oak. And you'll see that they look a little bit different. This is coming from a cooperage that our parent company, Remy Cointreau, works with in California. So these were just filled in 2019. It's a total experiment. I promise you, you do not see new oak in a butt size like ever. So we're gonna see how that goes. Apart from these casks that you see right here, our big project is our local oak project. So that is with Garyana or Gary oak, okay, or also called Oregon oak. So it grows all over Washington and Oregon. And it's something that Matt tapped into back in like 2011. And he wanted to work with a cooperage that would make some Garyana casks for us, and we could age our whiskey in it. And that is a big annual release that we've done for the last, going on our 6th year. And Gary oak is such a different flavor than white American oak. Okay, white American oak, you're getting flavors of like vanilla, kind of like creme brulee, kind of like butterscotch, coconut definitely comes through. Definitely those brighter, more sweet notes. Garyana is not shy. Garyana, from my experience trying it in the lab with just some of these pale malts, it's like barbecue rub, paprika, cloves. It's like all those notes you get in the white American oak, just darker, richer, deeper, almost like a molasses note. It absolutely reminded me of bacon bits one time. It's just like it would go perfectly with pulled pork or ribs, making me hungry. So yeah, great. Garyana is fantastic. It's the reason we don't use 100% Garyana wood in the Garyana bottling, or we don't do single casts of it, is because it's so powerful. It overpowers the barley for sure. We learned that the hard way doing some single casts a few years ago. So every year we just use it in a smaller percentage. And the other reason that we don't use it entirely is because it is an endangered species of tree now. And we actually wait until one falls or dies naturally. That would be horrible if we were just cutting down Garyana trees willy-nilly. So we actually, as a company, go all over this area, especially down by GBLM. There's a plot of land where we have replanted baby Garyana trees, and we're trying to help them grow. And those trees, 100 years old until they're ready to even become a barrel. So it's definitely takes quite a while, but we're trying to give back in that way too. Other cool projects that we do, besides using these casks, there's a lot of breweries here in Washington and Seattle specifically. Okay, the beer scene has been huge here for decades. So we've been trying to support local businesses and these breweries by partnering with them. So don't know if you're a beer fan or not, but a lot of times breweries are looking for barrels to age some of their beer in. And so it's kind of this perfect opportunity to partner with them and say, yeah, we have all these whiskey barrels. You can use ours. We just ask that after you're done aging that beer, we can get it back. And we want to basically finish aging our whiskey with that beer influence. So we've already done a handful. I want to say about like 5 or 6 now. For those of you that kind of know or in this area, we've worked with Holy Mountain recently. That was crazy good. The next one's going to be with Bellwether out of Spokane, Lucky Envelope, Silver City, Colshan up in Bellingham. I know I definitely forgot one. Oh, Black Raven. How could I forget that one? So it's been really fun. There's about 30 at least breweries that we're working with that have our barrels right now, as well as a couple cider places. So you're going to see about twice a year some of these beer cast finished whiskeys coming out, and we're stoked. It's a cool way to partner with them. So that is our production tour and everything that goes into the whiskey making. I also want to do a shout out. I should have done it in the Barley station, but we're working with Dr. Steve Jones, who is a professor with WSU. He used to be at the Pullman campus, and now he's actually up in Skagit Valley area, kind of with an extension center. So he runs the WSU bread lab up there. And he's a grain breeder. So we've been working with him since the beginning to help us kind of find these unique barleys that are outside of the commodity system that no one's using to be able to make whiskey out of and help support farmers up in the Skagit Valley. So if you've ever been over there, that's fantastic. If you haven't, make it a trip over there. Do it while the tulips are in bloom, I guess, whatever it takes to get you out there, because Steve Jones is doing some phenomenal work. And because of our support from Remy Cointreau, we've actually been able to fund a PhD student for 4 years to do some barley research with Steve Jones and the bread lab. So we are so stoked about it. Louis just started this last year. So we're expecting some really great things out of the bread lab. And so keep your eyes and ears open. So if I will leave this open now, if anybody has any questions about the production side, if I haven't talked your ear off already, I promise I breathe. I'm happy to answer them live, and then I'll give it a minute or two, and then we'll go into the tasting room and talk about some of the actual whiskey itself and some tasting notes. So what questions do you have for me? And Kate, you can definitely fire these away if anybody's in the chat. We can do it that way.
Hey, I want to know how you get Scottish peat from Scotland to the state of Washington. How do you transport Scottish peat?
Yeah, so interesting on that one. Not easily, it's thousands of miles. And they were the only place that we could get peated barley out of. The malting company is called Baird's, and it's kind of made to order, which is interesting. But you can say, hey, I want a peated barley. I don't want it maybe super smoky. Maybe I'm looking at like, like 5 ppm to 10 ppm. And they'll make that peated barley for you. If you're Ardbeg, Laphroaig, any of those, not Octomore, not Brewquality. They do that specialty there themselves. But you can say, hey, I want a really smoky peated malt. What do you have for me? And yeah, so it's made to order. And honestly, even on the islands there, even in Islay, a lot of them will use mainland, peat or in peated barley. They'll just order it. It's not necessarily local barley. So yeah, it's all kind of coming from the same places over there. So to get it shipped across the ocean, okay, on these huge ships, the fuel they use to ship that over isn't great. I forget the name, but it's not exactly great for the environment. So that was kind of one of our reasons to get away from that, is we're trying to reduce our carbon footprint. Pretty intense goals of trying to be carbon neutral moving forward in just a few years. And so we're really trying to do what we can. Actually, our farm up north, it's already certified salmon safe, and we're getting there to be certified organic, and eventually down the road regenerative organic, which is a huge thing to bite off and try to do, but we're very excited about it. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys. And let's go ahead and we're actually going to talk about some of the whiskey itself. So I'm really curious on if anybody was able to purchase a bottle of whiskey. Obviously, it was not required for this. Oh, I see some thumbs up. Awesome. So I'd kind of like to know, and Kate, you can help me out, but what bottles did you guys buy? I don't necessarily just want to go over every single whiskey that we have out right now, but yeah, who got the American oak, the sherry wood, peated, any specialty ones? I see some sherry wood. Okay.
We got 2. We have the sherry wood and the peated.
Beautiful.
2 bottles. We couldn't decide.
That is great. So yeah, let me actually grab. We have definitely some guests in the tasting room. So pardon me while I grab some. Okay, so I'm seeing some of our American oak, some of our peated. So to give you guys a glance, okay, here's some of our whiskey, that we have available right now. So I'm actually just going to go over the American oak real quick and the Calera, And I'm happy to answer kind of any questions. But let's make this casual. We have a leather couch here. I'm taking a seat. We'll go over some stuff. So I think for most people, it sounds like we got kind of a variety. So I'll kind of give you the, elevator pitch, if you will. That's not a good way to say it. I'll just give you the kind of the quick details about every single one of our core range whiskeys, because it's probably what you're most familiar with seeing. If you've gone to a Total Wine or a Bedmo or any of those big liquor stores, you're probably going to see something with a label like this. So American Oak was our previous flagship whiskey. We actually just released a new one, but this was kind of our baby from the beginning. It makes our 5 malt barley shine through. So this is the one that has that really cool chocolate note. This one's also aged entirely in new American oak casks. So it's kind of this, I call it a bourbon drinker single malt. When we have people come in and they're like, do you make bourbon? I say, no, but try this one, because every single person that's been a bourbon drinker that I've interacted with has tried this one and really leaned towards it. It's really approachable. So, and you're not seeing that combination, like I said, of new American oak and barley. They're using those ex-bourbon casks in Scotland a lot. So you don't usually get to see that combination. But the roasted malts hold up to that new oak really well. They just kind of pair really nicely. They can kind of stand each other and balance each other out really nice. So some of our signature house notes or house profile, if you will, are things like this waffle cone and kind of creme brulee or kind of a custardy note that I definitely personally get a lot in all of our whiskeys. The American oak also has some of these like cool cherry and citrus notes that definitely shine through. Again, some coming from our yeast, some coming from the wood, some coming from the barley for sure. So it's kind of a cool balance. If you're a cocktail person, great old fashioned, great Manhattan. Manhattan's for sure. This one's very versatile. The sherry wood, okay, it's going to be similar label. It's just going to be that more deep, like kind of purple color. So this is actually the same exact recipe as our American oak. It's got some new oak in it. Literally the only difference is we're adding in the sherry casks. And what I like about it is we're using two different types of sherry. So we're using Oloroso, which is a dry sherry, and then Pedro Jimenez or PX. And that is a like sweeter, delicious, it's like raisin syrup if you've ever drinking it, sherry. So you're getting the best of both worlds. Now, for you Scotch drinkers out there, you've probably seen plenty of sherry finished whiskeys or sherry influenced whiskeys. Kay Macallan, of course, does 99.9% of their bottles in sherry. Glenfarclas, the La Santa by Glenmorangie. There's some really good sherry bombs out there. But usually how they're using sherry in Scotland is they're finishing it. They start, the first 10, 15 years in an ex-bourbon cask, and then they transfer it to that sherry cask for a year just to get some of that sherry flavor. We're doing things a little bit different. It's not sherry finished. Some of the whiskey is going into that Oloroso cask for its entire maturity. So minimum 3 years, up to 5 years even. And then some of it is going into PX for its entire time. And then the remaining bit of that whiskey is going to start in new oak, and then we'll transfer it to sherry. And at the end, we blend it all together. Now, this is important just to clarify. It's not a blended whiskey. Okay. It's what's called vatting. So all whiskey, I don't care where you're from, unless it says single cask or single barrel, it is blended in some capacity to get those flavors. Okay. But it is referred to as vatting here. So that is helping with consistency throughout all the bottlings, all the batches. Okay. Now our peated, I saw at least a few people got our peated. I always get extra excited when people get peated. Maybe I'm biased, but I love our core range peated because it's simple yet complex. It's probably one of the more difficult ones to batch just because of it, so much going on. So it's 45 to 50% peated barley, that Scottish barley. Okay. And the rest is going to be our 5 malt. So it's kind of cool to get peat and roasted barley together, like never seen it before. And then we're using a combination of new oak and ex-bourbon casks. So it's really approachable. It's something that I've given to my friends and family when they've never had a peated whiskey before, and they're trying to figure out if they like it or not. It's inviting. It's not going to scare anybody away. Works well in a penicillin, 100% a penicillin from my experience, or Godfather. It's great. The more and more I come back to it, every time when I smell it on the nose now, I personally almost get like that banana note or like plantains. There's kind of this tropical fruit note. There's sort of this like roasted nut note in there. But you can definitely tell that like campfire note. It's not going to be briny or medicinal. I know some people's experience with Scotch is their first one is like a heavily peated or very highly peated single malt that scares them away. I was in that boat. I started drinking whiskey in college, and I was in Ohio. So that's definitely bourbon country in that area. And so my palate was bourbon and rye and whiskey cocktails, like old fashions. And then I went out to celebrate one night, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to get a Scotch. I deserve it. I did good today. I don't remember what I did, and so I went to just like a wine bar, and I researched online. I'm like, what's the best rated, Scotch I'm going to treat myself. And Lagavulin 16 pops up, and I had no idea what peat was. I had no idea what Lagavulin, didn't even know how to say it. And I ordered it, and I hadn't even sipped on it. I just smelled it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is liquid seaweed and gauze bandage and iodine. Like, people like this? So what is wrong with people? And I did not like it. And I can tell you today, I have a couple bottles at home of that exact same Scotch. And it's a totally different experience. Like I have it now, and I'm like, I don't get those things. I get totally like other beautiful fruity things, like floral things. It's just it's a wonderful, wonderful Scotch. But so yes, I think it's very important when you're introducing people to a peated whiskey to choose wisely. And yeah, I think ours definitely fits the mold on that. It does a good job. So those are our core range whiskeys. And one last thing I want to go over just on cool bottlings and things that we're doing. If you're looking to come into the tasting room, especially, this is our most recent special release. It's a really cool bottle. It's called Calere. So this is part of the same series that our Garyana bottle is in. So Garyana kind of already hit our local oak project, okay, using local wood. This is our local barley. So every year it's going to be a different locally grown barley up in Skagit Valley, okay, working with the WC Bread Lab. And yeah, it's going to be really fun. This one's called Alba, and it's one of the very first barleys that Skagit Valley Malting produced. So back in 2015. And we were so excited about it. This one you do not see brewed or definitely not made of whiskey out of, because again, it doesn't produce very high yields, but the flavor is like sweet and fruity. It's delicious. It's this wonderful 6-row winter barley. And yeah, we made basically 20 barrels or 20 casks, 10 went into Calere, and the other 10 got divvied up into Garyana, Export, and ex Oloroso sherry casks, and those are going to continue to age. So if you're a Garyana fan, if you've actually had our Garyanas, because they vary year to year, we'll see some Alba barley in there in the years to come. So I'm really excited about that project. It's a totally different flavor profile. The Calere was actually aged just in ex-bourbon and ex-Westland casks. And the ex-Westland casks are probably some of my favorite. It's such a cool flavor, having our 5-malt whiskey in a cask and then introducing something else to it. You're not seeing that anywhere else. So I don't want to say I'm biased, but I'm digging this Calere like a lot. So if you are in Seattle area or in Washington, get your butts over here. I actually work in the tasting room. I do all of our cocktails too. So honestly, if you ever have any questions, you can shoot me an email at jenna.sagmoen@westlanddistillery.com, or just pop in. I will probably be here, and I'd love to chat and give you some samples of our whiskey, because why not? So. And yes, I appreciate all of you guys being very patient and willing to jump on, because, a virtual distillery tour, again, it's like, how does that work? But I hope you had a really good experience. And I hope, thank you, Kate, for working in the chat and answering everybody's questions. I appreciate the questions you guys popped up with. And yeah, when we start doing in-person tours, definitely come back in, and I'll probably be the one giving it. So thank you all so much. Brittany, I'll pass it back to you if you want any finishing thoughts for everybody, but go WCU. You guys are awesome.
Thank you so much, Jenna. You did such an amazing job. And I think we can all say that we learned a lot during this tour. So thank you so much. And I will send out an email tomorrow to everyone with more information on how to purchase all the whiskey and to go to their tours in person, because we all know that we want to go back in person and do things in person. So I will send that all out to you tomorrow, but I hope you guys all have a lovely evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again, Jenna. And thank you, Kate.
Great. Thank you, Brittany.
Cheers.
Take care, everybody.